Wedding Preparations in the Country by Franz Kafka. When Edward Raban, coming along the passage, walked into the open doorway, he saw that it was raining. It was not raining much. On the pavement straight in front of him, there were many people walking in various rhythms. Every now and again one would step forward and cross the road. A little girl was holding a tired puppy in her outstretched hands. Two gentlemen were exchanging information. The one held his hands palm upward, raising and lowering them in regular motion, as though he were balancing a load. Then one caught sight of a lady whose hat was heavily laden with ribbons, buckles, and flowers. And hurrying past was a young man with a thin walking stick, his left hand, as though paralyzed, flat on his chest. Now and then there came men who were smoking, bearing small, upright, elongated clouds along ahead of them. Three gentlemen, two holding light-weight overcoats on their crooked forearms, several times walked forward from the front of the buildings to the edge of the pavement, surveyed what was going on there, and then withdrew again, talking. Through the gaps between the passers-by one could see the regularly laid stones of the carriageway. Their carriages on delicate high wheels were drawn along by horses with arched necks. The people who sat at ease on the upholstered seats gazed silently at the pedestrians, the shops, the balconies, and the sky. If it happened that one carriage overtook another, then the horses would press against each other, and the harness straps hung dangling. The animals tugged at the shafts. The carriage bowled along, swaying as it gathered speed, until the swerve around the carriage ahead was completed and the horses moved apart again, only their narrow, quiet heads inclined toward each other. Some people came quickly toward the front entrance, stopped on the dry mosaic paving, and, turning around slowly, stood gazing out into the rain, which, wedged in by this narrow street, fell confusedly. Raban felt tired. His lips were as pale as the faded red of his thick tie, which had a Moorish pattern. The lady by the doorsteps over there, who had up to now been contemplating her shoes, which were quite visible under her tightly drawn skirt, now looked at him. She did so indifferently, and she was perhaps in any case only looking at the falling rain in front of him, or at the small nameplates of firms that were fixed to the door over his head. Raban thought she looked amazed. Well, he thought, if I could tell her the whole story, she would cease to be astonished. One works so feverishly at the office that afterwards one is too tired even to enjoy one's holidays properly. But even all that work does not give one a claim to be treated lovingly by everyone. On the contrary, one is alone, a total stranger, and only an object of curiosity. And so long as you say one instead of I, there's nothing in it, and one can easily tell the story. But as soon as you admit to yourself that it is you yourself, you feel as though transfixed, and are horrified. He put down the suitcase with the checkered cloth cover, bending his knees in doing so. The rainwater was already running along the edge of the carriageway in streaks that almost extended to the lower-lying gutters. But if I myself distinguish between one and I, how then dare I complain about the others? Probably they're not unjust, but I'm too tired to take it all in. I'm even too tired to walk all the way to the station without an effort, and it's only a short distance. So why don't I remain in town over these short holidays in order to recuperate? How unreasonable I'm being. The journey will make me ill. I know that quite well. My room won't be comfortable enough. It can't be otherwise in the country. And we're hardly in the first half of June. The air in the country is often still very cool. Of course, I've taken precautions in my clothing, but I shall have to join with people who go for walks late in the evening. There are ponds there. One will go for a walk the length of those ponds. That's where I'm sure to catch cold. On the other hand, I shall make but little showing in conversation. I shan't be able to prepare the pond with other ponds in some remote country, for I've never travelled, and talking about the moon and feeling bliss and rapturously climbing up on heaps of rubble is, after all, something I'm too old to do without being laughed to scorn. People were going past with slightly bent heads, above which they carried their dark umbrellas in a loose grip. A dray also went by. On the driver's seat, which was stuffed with straw, sat a man whose legs were stretched out so negligently that one foot was almost touching the ground, while the other rested safely on straw and rags. It looked as though he were sitting in a field in fine weather. Yet he was holding the reins attentively, so that the dray, on which iron bars were clanging against one another, made its way safely through the dense traffic. On the wet surface of the road, one could see the reflection of the iron meandering and slowly gliding from one row of cobbles to the next. The little boy beside the lady opposite was dressed like an old vintner. His pleated dress formed a great circle at the hem and was only held in, almost under the very armpits, by a leather strap. His hemispherical cap came down to his eyebrows, and a tassel hung down from the top as far as his left ear. He was pleased by the rain. He ran out of the doorway and looked up wide-eyed into the sky in order to catch more of the rain. Often he jumped high into the air, so that the water splashed a great deal, and passers-by admonished him severely. Then the lady called him, and henceforth held him by the hand, yet he did not cry. Robin started. Had it not grown late? Since he wore his top-coat and jacket open, he quickly pulled out his watch. It was not going. Irritably, he asked a neighbor, who was standing a little farther back in the entrance, what the time was. This man was in conversation, and while still laughing, together with his companion, said, "Certainly, past 4 o'clock," and turned away. Robin quickly put up his umbrella and picked up his suitcase. But when he was about to step into the street, his way was blocked by several women in a hurry, and these he therefore let pass first. In doing so, he looked down on a little girl's hat, which was made of plaited red straw, and had a little green wreath on the wavy brim. He went on remembering this even when he was in the street, which went slightly uphill in the direction he wished to follow. Then he forgot it, for now he had to exert himself a little. His small suitcase was none too light, and the wind was blowing straight against him, making his coat flutter and bending the front spokes of his umbrella. He had to breathe more deeply. A clock in a nearby square down below struck 5:15. Under the umbrella he saw the light, short steps of the people coming toward him. Carriage wheels squeaked with the brakes on, turning more slowly. The horses stretched their thin forelegs, daring as chamois in the mountains. Then it seemed to Robin that he would get through the long bad time of the next fortnight too, for it was only a fortnight, that was to say a limited period, and even if the annoyances grew ever greater, still the time during which one had to endure them would be growing shorter and shorter. Thus, undoubtedly, courage would increase. All the people who try to torment me, and who have now occupied the entire space around me, will quite gradually be thrust back by the beneficent passage of these days, without my having to help them even in the very least. And as it will come about quite naturally, I can be weak and quiet, and let everything happen to me, and yet everything must turn out well, through the sheer fact of the passing of the days. And besides, can't I do it the way I always used to as a child in matters that were dangerous? I don't even need to go to the country myself. It isn't necessary. I'll send my clothed body. If it staggers out of the door of my room, the staggering will indicate not my fears but its nothingness. Nor is it a sign of excitement if it stumbles on the stairs, if it travels into the country, sobbing as it goes, and there eats its supper in tears, for I myself am meanwhile lying in my bed, smoothly covered over with the yellow-brown blanket, exposed to the breeze that is wafted through the seldom aired room. The carriages and people in the street move and walk hesitantly on shining ground, for I am still dreaming. Coachmen and pedestrians are shy, and every step they want to advance they ask as a favor from me. By looking at me, I encourage them and encounter no obstacle. As I lie in bed, I assume the shape of a big beetle, a stag beetle, or a cockchafer, I think. In front of a shop window in which, behind a wet glass pane, little hats for men were displayed on small pegs, he stopped and looked in, his lips pursed. Well, my hat will still do for the holidays, he thought, and walked on. And if nobody can stand me because of my hat, then all the better. The form of the large beetle. Yes. Then I would pretend it was a matter of hibernating, and I would press my little legs to my bulging body. And I would whisper a few words, instructions to my sad body, which stands close beside me, bent. Soon I shall have done. It bows, it goes swiftly, and it will manage everything efficiently while I rest." He came to a domed arch at the top of the steep street, leading onto a small square all around which there were many shops already lit up. In the middle of the square, somewhat obscured by the light around the edge, was a low monument, the seated, meditative figure of a man. The people moved across the lights like narrow shutters, and since the puddle spread all the brilliance far and wide, the square seemed ceaselessly changing. Raban pressed far into the square, but jerkily, dodging the drifting carriages, jumping from one dry cobble to further dry cobbles, and holding the open umbrella high in his hand in order to see everything all around. Finally, by a lamp-post, a small where the electric tram stopped. Finally, by a lamp-post, a place where the electric tram stopped, which was set up on a small square concrete base, he halted. "But they're expecting me in the country. Won't they be wondering about me by this time? Still, I haven't written to her all the week she's been in the country, until this morning. So they'll end up by imagining that even my appearance is quite different. They may be thinking that I burst forward when I address a person, yet that isn't my way at all, or that I embrace people when I arrive, and that's something I don't do either. I shall make them angry if I try to pacify them. Oh, if I could only make them thoroughly angry in the attempt to pacify them." At that moment an open carriage drove past, not quickly. Behind its two lighted lamps, two ladies could be seen sitting on dark leather seats. One was leaning back, her face hidden by a veil and the shadow of her hat. But the other lady was sitting bolt upright. Her hat was small. It was edged with thin feathers. Everyone could see her. Her lower lip was drawn slightly into her mouth. As soon as the carriage had passed Raban, some bar blocked the view of the near horse drawing the carriage. Then some coachman, wearing a big top hat, on an unusually high box, was moved across in front of the ladies. This was now much farther on. Then their carriage drove around the corner of a small house that now became strikingly noticeable and disappeared from sight. Raban followed it with his gaze, his head lowered, resting the handle of his umbrella on his shoulder in order to see better. He had put his right thumb into his mouth and was rubbing his teeth on it. His suitcase lay beside him, one of its sides on the ground. Carriages hastened from street to street across the square. The horses' bodies flew along horizontally, as though they were being flung through the air. But the nodding of the head and the neck revealed the rhythm and effort of the movement. Around about, on the edges of the pavements of all the three streets converging here, there were many idlers standing about, tapping the cobbles with little sticks. Among the groups they formed there were little towers in which girls were pouring out lemonade, then heavy street clocks on thin bars, then men wearing before and behind them big placards announcing entertainments in multicolored letters, then messengers. 2 pages missing from this document. Footnote. A little social gathering. 2 elegant private carriages, driving diagonally across the square into the street leading downhill. Got in the way of some gentlemen from this party. But after the second carriage, even after the first, they had timidly tried to do so. These gentlemen formed into a group, had timidly tried to do so. I swear I'm becoming fucking dyslexic. Two elegant private carriages, driving diagonally across the square into the street leading downhill, got in the way of some gentlemen from this party. But after the second carriage, even after the first, they had timidly tried to do so. These gentlemen formed into a group again with the others, with whom they then stepped on to the pavement in a long cavalcade, and pushed their way through the door of a cafe, overwhelmed by the light of the incandescent lamps hanging over the entrance. Electric tramcars moved past. Huge and very close, others vaguely visible, stood motionless, far away in the streets. How bent she is, Rabin thought, when he looked at the photograph now. She is never really upright, and perhaps her back is round. I shall have to pay much attention to this. And her mouth is so wide, and here, beyond doubt, the lower lip protrudes. Yes, now I remember that too. And what a dress! Of course, I don't know anything about clothes, but these are very tight sewn sleeves. Of course, I don't know anything about clothes, but these very tight sewn sleeves are ugly. I am sure they look like bandages. And the hat, the brim, at every point turned up from the face in a different curve. But her eyes are beautiful. They're brown, if I'm not mistaken. Everyone says her eyes are beautiful. Now an electric tramcar stopped in front of Rabin, and many people around him pushed toward the steps, with slightly open pointed umbrellas, which they held upright with their hands pressed to their shoulders. Rabin, who was holding his suitcase under his arm, was dragged off the pavement and stepped hard into an unseen puddle. Inside the tram a child knelt on a seat, pressing the tips of all its fingers to its lips, as though it were saying goodbye to someone going away. Some passengers got out and had to walk a few paces along the tram in order to work their way out of the crowd. Then a lady climbed onto the first step, her long skirt, which she hitched up with both hands stretched tightly around her legs. A gentleman held on to a brass rod, and with lifted head recounted something to the lady. All the people who wanted to get in were impatient. The conductor shouted. Rabin, who now stood on the edge of the waiting group, turned around, for someone had called out his name. "Ah, Lament," he said slowly, and held out to a young man coming toward him the little finger of the hand in which he was holding the umbrella. "So this is the bridegroom on his way to his bride. He looks frightfully in love," Lament said, and then smiled with his mouth shut. "Yes, you must forgive my going today," Rabin said. "I wrote to you this afternoon anyway. I should, of course, have liked very much to travel with you tomorrow, but tomorrow is Saturday. Everything'll be so crowded, it's a long journey." "Oh, that doesn't matter. You did promise that when one's in love, I shall just have to travel along." Lament had set one foot on the pavement and the other on the cobbles, supporting his body, now on one leg, now on the other. You were going to get into the tram. There it goes. Come, we'll walk. I'll go with you. There's still plenty of time. Isn't it rather late? Please tell me. It's no wonder you're nervous, but you really got plenty of time. I'm not so nervous, and that's why I've missed Gilliman now. Gilliman? Won't he be staying out there too? Yes, with his wife. It's next week they mean to go, and that's just why I promised Gilliman I'd meet him today when he leaves the office. He wanted to give me some instructions regarding the furnishings of their house. That's why I supposed to meet him. That's why I was supposed to meet him. But now somehow I'm late. I had some errands to do. And just as I was wondering whether I should go to their apartment, I saw you. Was at first astonished at the suitcase and spoke to you. But now the evening's too far gone for paying calls. It's fairly impossible to go to Gilliman now. Of course. And so I shall meet people I know there after all. Not that I have ever seen Frau Gilliman, though. And very beautiful she is. She's fair and pale now after her illness. She has the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen. Do please tell me, what do beautiful eyes look like? Is it the glance? I've never found eyes beautiful. All right, perhaps I was exaggerating slightly. Still, she's a pretty woman. Through the window pane of a ground-floor cafe, close to the window, gentlemen could be seen sitting reading and eating around the three-sided table. One had lowered a newspaper to the table, held a little cup raised, and was looking into the street out of the corners of his eyes. Beyond these window tables, all the furniture and equipment in the large restaurant were hidden by the customers, who sat side by side in little circles. Footnote, 2 pages missing. As it happens, however, it's not such an unpleasant business, is it? Many people would take on such a burden, I think. They came into a fairly dark square, which began on their side of the street, for the opposite side extended further. On the side of the square, along which they were walking, there was an uninterrupted row of houses, from the corners of which two at first widely distant rows of houses extended into the indiscernible distance in which they seemed to unite. The pavement was narrow by the houses, which were mostly small. There were no shops to be seen, no carriage passed. An iron post near the end of the street, out of which they came, had several lamps on it, which were fixed in 2 rings hanging horizontally, one over the other. The trapeze-shaped flame between conjoined sheets of glass burned in this tower-like wide darkness, as in a little room, letting darkness assert itself a few steps further on. But now I am sure it is too late. You have kept it a secret from me, and I shall miss the train. Why? Footnote, 4 pages missing. Yes, at most. Perker chauffeur. Well, what's he's worth? Well, for what he's worth. The name mentioned, I think, in Betty's letters. He's an assistant railway clerk, isn't he? Yes, an assistant railway clerk, and an unpleasant person. You'll see I'm right as soon as you've got a glimpse of that small, thick nose. I tell you, walking through the dreary fields with that fellow. Anyway, he's been transferred now, and he goes away from there as I believe and hope next week. Wait, you said just now you advised me to stay here tonight. I've thought it over. It couldn't very well be managed. I've written to say I'm coming this evening. They'll be expecting me. That's quite easy. Send a telegram. Yes, that could be done, but it wouldn't be very nice if I didn't go. And I'm tired, yes. I'll go all right. If a telegram came, they'd get a fright into the bargain. And what for? Where would we go anyway? Then it's really better for you to go. I was only thinking. Anyway, I couldn't go with you today, as I'm sleepy. I forgot to tell you that. And now I shall say goodbye, for I don't want to go through the wet park with you, as I should like to drop in at Gilliman's after all. It's 6:15, so not too late. After all, Fort Payne calls on people you know fairly well. Adieu. Well, a good journey, and remember me to everyone. Lament turned to the right and held out his right hand to say goodbye, so that for a moment Robin was walking against Lament's outstretched arm. Adieu, Robin said. From a little distance, Lament then called back. I say, Edward, can you hear me? Do shut your umbrella. It stopped raining ages ago. I didn't have a chance to tell you. Robin did not answer, shut his umbrella, and the sky closed over him in pallid darkness. If at least, Robin thought, I were to get into a wrong train, then it would, at any rate, seem to me that the whole enterprise had begun, and if later, after the mistake had been cleared up, I were to arrive in this station again on my way back, then I should certainly feel much better. If the scenery does turn out to be boring, as Lament says, that need not be a disadvantage at all. One will spend more time in the rooms and really never know for certain where all the others are, for if there is a ruin in the district, there will probably be a walk altogether to that ruin. It will have been agreed upon some time before. Then, however, one must look forward to it. For that very reason, one mustn't miss it. But if there is no such sight to be seen, then there will be no discussion beforehand either, for all will be expected to get together quite easily if suddenly, against all the usual practice, a large expedition is considered right, for one only has to send the maid into the others' apartments, where they are sitting over a letter or books, and are delighted by the news. Well, it is not difficult to protect oneself against such invitations, and yet I don't know whether I shall be able to, for it is not so easy as I imagine it now, when I am still alone, and can still do everything, can still go back if I want to, for I shall have no one there whom I could pay calls on whenever I like, and no one with whom I could make more strenuous expeditions, no one there who could show me how his crops are doing, or show me a quarry he is working there. For one isn't at all sure even of acquaintances of long standing. Wasn't Lament nice to me today? He explained some things to me, didn't he, and described everything as it will appear to me. He came up and spoke to me, and then walked with me, in spite of the fact that there was nothing he wanted to find out from me, and that he himself still had something to say. Something. He came up and spoke to me, and then walked with me, in spite of the fact that there was nothing he wanted to find out from me, and that he himself still had something else to do. But now all of a sudden he has gone away, and yet I can't have offended him even with a single word. I did refuse to spend the evening in town, but that was only natural. That can't have offended him, for he is a sensible person. The station clock struck. It was 6:15. Robin stopped because he had palpitations, and he walked quickly along the park pool, went along a narrow, badly lighted path between large shrubs, rushed into an open place with many empty benches leaning against little trees, then went more slowly through an opening in the railings into the street, crossed it, leapt through the station entrance, after a while found the booking office, and had to knock for a while on the iron shutter. Then the booking clerk looked out, said it was really high time, took the banknote, and slammed down on the counter the ticket he had been asked for, and the change. Now Robin tried to count his change quickly, thinking he ought to be getting more, but a porter who was walking nearby hurried him through a glass door onto the platform. There Robin looked around while calling out, thank you, to the porter, and since he found no guard, he climbed up the steps of the nearest coach by himself, each time putting the suitcase on the step above, then following himself, supporting himself on his umbrella with one hand, and on the handle of the suitcase with the other. The coach that he entered was brightly illuminated by the great amount of light from the main hall of the station, in which it was standing. In front of many a window pane, all were shut right up to the top. A hissing arc lamp hung at about eye level, and the many raindrops on the glass were white. Often single ones would move. Robin could hear the noise from the platform even when he had shut the carriage door and sat on the last little free bit of light brown wooden seat. He saw many people's backs, and the backs of their heads, and between them the upturned faces of people on the seat opposite. In some places smoke was curling from the pipes and cigars. In one place, drifting limply past the face of a girl. Often the passengers would change places, discussing these changes with each other, or they would transfer their luggage, which lay in a narrow blue net over a seat, to another one. If a stick or the metal-covered corner of a suitcase stuck out, then the owner would have his attention drawn to this. He would go over and straighten it. Robin also bethought himself and pushed his suitcase under his seat. On his left, at the window, two gentlemen were sitting opposite each other, talking about the price of goods. They're commercial travelers, Robin thought, and, breathing regularly, he gazed at them. The merchant sends them into the country. They obey. They travel by train, and in every village they go from shop to shop. The merchant sends them into the country. They obey. They travel by train, and in every village they go from shop to shop. Sometimes they travel by carriage between the villages. They must not stay long anywhere, for everything must be done fast, and they must always talk only about their goods. With that pleasure, then, one can exert oneself in an occupation that is so agreeable. The younger man had jerked a notebook out of the hip pocket of his trousers, rapidly flicked the leaves over with a forefinger moistened on his tongue, and then read through a page, drawing the back of his fingernail down at it as he went. He looked at Raban as he glanced up, and indeed, when he now began talking about thread prices, did not turn his face away from Raban, as one gazes steadily at a point in order not to forget anything of what one wants to say. At the same time, he drew his brows tightly down over his eyes. He held the half-closed notebook in his left hand, with his thumb on the page he had been reading, in order to be able to refer to it easily if he should need to, and the notebook trembled, for he was not supporting his arm on anything, and the couch, which was now in motion, beat on the rails like a hammer. The other traveler sat leaning back, listening and nodding at regular intervals. It was evident that he was far from agreeing with everything, and later would give his own opinion. Raban laid his curved hands palm down on his knees, and leaning forward between the travelers' heads, he saw the window, and through the window lights flitting past, and others flitting away into the distance. He did not understand anything of what the traveler was talking about, nor would he understand the other's answer. Much preparation would first be required, for here were people who had been concerned with goods since their youth. But if one has held a spool of thread in one's hand so often and handed it to one's customer so often, then one knows the price and can talk about it, while villages come towards us and flash past, while at the same time they turn away into the depths of the country, where for us they must disappear. And yet these villages are inhabited, and there perhaps travellers go from shop to shop. In a corner at the far end of the coach, a tall man stood up, holding playing cards in his hand, and called out, "I say, Mary. I say, Marie, did you pack the Zephyr shirts?" "Of course I did," said the woman, who was sitting opposite Raban. She had been dozing, and now when the question waked her, she answered as though she were talking to herself or to Raban. "You're going to market at Jungbungslau, eh?" the vivacious traveller asked her. "Jungbungslau, that's right. It's a big market this time, isn't it? A big market, that's right." She was sleepy. She rested her left elbow on a blue bundle, and her head dropped heavily against her hand, which pressed through the flesh of the cheek to the neck. She was sleepy. She rested her left elbow on a blue bundle, and her head dropped heavily against her hand, which pressed through the flesh of the cheek to the cheekbone. "How young she is," the traveller said. Raban took the money that he had received from the cashier out of his waistcoat pocket and counted it over. He held up each coin firmly between thumb and forefinger for a long time, and also twisted it this way and that on the inner surface of his thumb with the tip of his forefinger. He looked for a long time at the emperor's image. Then he was struck by the laurel wreath and the way it fastened with knots and bows of ribbon at the back of the head. At last he found the sum was correct, and put the money into a big black purse. But now, when he was about to say to the traveller, "They're a married couple, don't you think?" the train stopped. The noise of the journey ceased. Guards shouted the name of a place, and Raban said nothing. The train started again so slowly that one could picture the revolutions of the wheels, but a moment later it was racing down a slope, and all unexpectedly the tall railings of a bridge outside the windows were torn apart and pressed together, as it seemed. Raban was now pleased that the train was going so fast, for he would not have wanted to stay in the last place. When it is dark there, when one knows no one there, when it is such a long way home. But then it must be terrible there by day, and it is different at the next station, for at the previous ones, or at the later ones, or at the village I am going to. The traveller was suddenly talking more loudly. "It's a long way yet," Raban thought. "Sir, you know just as well as I do these manufacturers send their travellers around the most God-forsaken little villages. They go crawling to the seediest of little shopkeepers, and do you think they offer them prices different from those they offer us big businessmen? Sir, take it from me, exactly the same prices. Only yesterday I saw it black on white. I call it villainy. They're squeezing us out of existence. Under current conditions, it's simply impossible for us to do business." Again he looked at Raban. He was not ashamed of the tears in his eyes. He pressed the knuckles of his left hand to his mouth because his lips were quivering. Raban leaned back and tugged faintly at his moustache with his left hand. The shopwoman opposite woke up and smilingly passed her hands over her forehead. The traveller talked more quietly. Once again the woman shifted as though settling down to sleep, half lying on her bundle, and sighed. The skirt was drawn tight over her right hip. Behind her sat a gentleman with a travelling cap on his head, reading a large newspaper. The girl opposite him, who was probably a relative of his, urged him, at the same time inclining her head toward her right shoulder, to open the window because it was so very hot. He said, without looking up, he would do it in a moment, only he must first finish reading an article in the newspaper, and he showed her which article he meant. The shopwoman could not go to sleep again. She sat upright and looked out the window. Then for a long time she looked at the oil lamp and the flame burning yellow near the ceiling of the carriage. Raban shut his eyes for a little while. When he glanced up, the shopwoman was just biting into a piece of cake that was spread with brown jam. The bundle next to her was open. The traveller was smoking a cigar in silence, and kept on fidgeting as though he were tapping the ash off the end of it. The other was poking about in the works of a pocket watch with the tip of a knife, so that one could hear it scraping. With his eyes almost shut, Raban still had time to see, in a blurred way, the gentleman in the travelling cap pulling at the window strap. There came a gust of cool air, and a straw hat fell from a hook. Raban thought he was waking up, and that was why his cheeks were so refreshed. Or someone was opening the door and drawing him into the room. Or he was in some way mistaken about things, and breathing deeply, he quickly fell asleep. Two. The steps of the couch were still shaking a little when Raban climbed down them. Into his face Coming out of the air of the carriage, the rain beat, and he shut his eyes. It was raining noisily on the corrugated iron roof of the station building, but out in the open country the rain fell in such a way that it sounded like the uninterrupted blowing of the wind. A barefoot boy came running up. Raban did not see from where, and breathlessly asked Raban to let him carry the suitcase, for it was raining. But Raban said, yes, it was raining, and he would therefore go by omnibus. He did not need him, he said. Thereupon the boy pulled a face as though he thought it grander to walk in the rain and have one suitcase carried than to go by bus, and instantly turned around and ran away. When Raban wanted to call him, it was already too late. There were 2 lighted lamps, and a station official came out of a door. Without hesitation, he walked through the rain to the engine, stood there motionless with his arms folded, and waited until the engine driver leaned over his rail and talked to him. A porter was called, came, and was sent back again. At many of the windows in the train there were passengers standing, and since what they had to look at was an ordinary railway station, their gaze was probably dim, the eyelids close together, as though the train were in motion. A girl came hurrying along from the road to the platform under a parasol with a flowered pattern. She set the open parasol on the ground and sat down, pushing her legs apart so that her skirt dry. A girl came hurrying along from the road to the platform under a parasol with a flowered pattern. She set the open parasol on the ground and sat down, pushing her legs apart so that her skirt should dry better, and ran her fingertips over the tight-stretched skirt. There were only 2 lamps alight. Her face was indistinguishable. The porter came past and complained that puddles were forming under the parasol. He held his arms in a semicircular before him in order to demonstrate the size of these puddles, and then moved his hands through the air, one after the other, like fishes sinking into deeper water, in order to make it clear the traffic was also being impeded by this parasol. The train started, disappeared like a long sliding door, and behind the poplars on the far side of the railway track there was the landscape, so massive that it took away one's breath. Was it at a dark view through a gap, or was it woods? Was it a pool, or a house in which the people were already asleep? Was it a church steeple, or a ravine between the hills? Nobody must dare to go there, but who could restrain himself? And when Raban caught sight of the official, he was already at the step up to his office. He ran in front of him and stopped him. "Excuse me, please. Is it far to the village? That's where I want to go." "No, a quarter of an hour. But by bus, as it's raining, you'll be there in 5 minutes." "It's raining. It's not a very fine spring," Raban said. The official put his right hand on his hip, and through the triangle formed by the arm and the body, Raban saw the girl, who had now shut the parasol, on the seat where she sat. If one is going on one's summer holidays now, it is going to stay there, one can't but regret it. Actually, I thought I should be met. He glanced around to make it seem plausible. "You will miss the bus, I'm afraid. It doesn't wait so long. Nothing to thank me for. That's the road between the hedges." The road outside the railway station was not lighted. Only from 3 ground-floor windows in the building, there came a misty glimmer, but it did not extend far. Raban walked on tiptoe through the mud and shouted, "Driver!" and "Hello there!" and "Omnibus!" and "Here I am!" many times. But when he landed among scarcely interrupted puddles on the dark side of the road, he had to tramp onwards with his heels down, until suddenly a horse's moist muzzle touched his forehead. There was the omnibus. He quickly climbed into the empty compartment, sat down by the window-pane behind the driver's box, and hunched his back into the corner, for he had done all that was necessary. For if the driver is asleep, he will wake up toward morning. If he is dead, then a new driver will come, or the innkeeper, and should that not happen either, then passengers will come by the early morning train, people in a hurry, making a noise. In any case, one can be quiet. One may even draw the curtains over the windows and wait for the jerk with which the vehicle must start. Yes, after all I have already accomplished, it is certain that tomorrow I shall get to Betty and to Mamma. Nobody can prevent that. Yet it is true, and was indeed to be foreseen, that my letter will arrive only tomorrow, so that I might very well have remained in town and spent an agreeable night at Elvie's without having to be afraid of the next day's work, the sort of thing that otherwise ruins every pleasure for me. But look, I've got my feet wet. He lit a stub of candle that he had taken out of his waistcoat pocket and set it on the seat opposite. It was bright enough. The darkness outside made it appear as though the omnibus had black, distempered walls, and no glass in the windows. There was no need to think that there were wheels under the floor, and in front of the horse, between the shafts. Raban rubbed his feet thoroughly on the seat, pulled on clean socks, and sat up straight. Then he heard someone from the station shouting, "Hi!" If there was anyone in the bus, he might say so. Yes, and he would like to start now, too, Raban answered, leaning out of the door, which he had opened, holding on to the doorpost with his right hand, the left hand held open close to his mouth. The rain gushed down the back of his neck inside his collar. Wrapped in the canvas of 2 sacks that had been cut up, the driver came over, the reflection of his stable lantern jumping through the puddles at his feet. Irritably, he began an explanation. "Listen here," he said. He had been playing cards with Labida, and they had just been getting on fine when the train came. It would really have been impossible for him to take a look outside then. Still, he did not mean to abuse anyone who did not understand that. Apart from that, this place here was a filthy dump, and no half measures, and it was hard to see what business a gentleman like this could have here. And he would be getting there soon enough anyway, so that he need not go and complain anywhere. Only just now, Herr Purkershofer, if you please, that's the junior assistant clerk, had come in and had said he thought a small fair man had been wanting to go by the omnibus. Well, so he had at once come and asked. Or hadn't he at once come and asked? The lantern was attached to the end of the shaft. The horse, having been shouted at in a muffled voice, began to pull, and the water on top of the bus, now said stirring, dripped slowly through a crack into the carriage. The road was perhaps hilly. There was surely mud flying up into the spokes. Fans of puddle water formed, with a rushing sound, behind the turning wheels. It was for the most part with loose reins that the driver guided the dripping horse. Could not all this be used as reproaches against Raban? Many puddles were unexpectedly lit up by the lantern trembling on the shaft, and split up in ripples under the wheel. This happened solely because Raban was travelling to his fiancée, to Betty, an oldish pretty girl, and who, if one were going to speak of it at all, would appreciate what merits Raban here had, even if it was only that he bore those reproaches, which admittedly nobody could make openly. Of course, he was doing it gladly. Betty was his fiancée. Betty was his fiancée. He was fond of her. It would be disgusting if she were to thank him for what as well. Betty was his fiancée. He was fond of her. It would be disgusting if she were to thank him for that as well. But all the same. Without meaning to, he often bumped his head on the panel against which he was leaning. Then for a while he looked up at the ceiling. Once his right hand slipped down from his thigh, where he had been resting it. But his elbow remained in the angle between belly and leg. The omnibus was now travelling between houses. Here and there, and inside of the coach, had a share of the light from a room. There were some steps. To see the first of them, Raban would have had to stand up. Built up to a church, outside a park gate, there was a lamp with a large flame burning in it, but a statue of a saint stood out in black relief, only because of the light from the draper's shop. The Raban saw his candle, which had burnt down, the trickle of wax hanging motionless from the seat. When the bus stopped outside the inn, and the rain could be heard loudly, and probably there was a window open, so could the voices of the guests, Raban wondered which would be better, to get out at once or to wait until the innkeeper came to the coach. What the custom was in this township he did not know, but it was pretty certain that Betty would have spoken of her fiancé, and according to whether his arrival here was magnificent or feeble. So the esteem in which she was held here would increase or diminish, and with that, again, his own too. But of course he knew neither what people felt about her nor what she had told them about him, and so everything was all the more disagreeable and difficult. Oh, beautiful city, and beautiful the way home. If it rains there, one goes home by tram over wet cobbles. Here one goes in a cart through mud to an inn. The city is far from here, and if I were now in danger of dying of homesickness, nobody could get me back there today. Well, anyway, I shouldn't die. But there I get the meal expected for the evening, set on the table, on the right behind my plate the newspaper, on the left the lamp. Here I shall be given some dreadfully fat dish. They don't know that I have a weak stomach, and even if they did know, an unfamiliar newspaper, many people whom I can already hear will be there, and one lamp will be lit for all. What sort of light can it provide? Enough to play cards, but for reading a newspaper? The innkeeper isn't coming. He's not interested in guests. He is probably an unfriendly man. Or does he know that I am Betty's fiancé, and does that give him a reason for not coming to fetch me in? It would be in accord with that the driver kept me waiting so long at the station. Betty has often told me, after all, how much she has been bothered by lecherous men, and how she has had to rebuff their insistence. Perhaps it is that here, too. Footnote. Text breaks off. Footnote. Second Manuscript. When Edouard Rabin, coming along the passage, walked into the open doorway, he could now see how it was raining. It was not raining much. On the pavement straight in front of him, not higher, not lower, there were, in spite of the rain, many passers-by. Every now and again one would step forward and cross the road. A little girl was carrying a grey dog on her outstretched arms. Two gentlemen were exchanging information on some subject, at times turning the whole front of their bodies to each other, and then slowly turning aside themselves. Again, it was like doors ajar in the wind. The one held his hands palm upward, raising and lowering them in regular motion, as though he were balancing a load, testing the weight of it. Then one caught sight of a slim lady whose face twitched slightly, like the flickering light of the stars, and whose flat hat was loaded high and to the brim with unrecognizable objects. She appeared to be a stranger to all the passers-by, without intending it, as though by some law, and hurrying past was a young man with a thin walking-stick, his left hand, as though paralyzed, lying flat on his chest. Many were out on business, in spite of the fact that they walked fast. One saw them longer than others, now on the pavement, now below. Their coats fitted them badly. They did not care how they carried themselves. They let themselves be pushed by the people, and they pushed too. Three gentlemen, two holding lightweight overcoats on their crooked forearms, walked from the front of the building to the edge of the pavement, in order to see what was going on in the carriageway and on the farther pavement. Through the gaps between the passers-by, now fleetingly, then comfortably, one saw the regular set cobbles in the carriageway, on which carriages, swaying on their wheels, were swiftly drawn by horses with arched necks. The people who sat at ease on the upholstered seats gazed in silence at the pedestrians, the shops, the balconies, and the sky. If it happened that one carriage overtook another, then the horses would press against each other, and the harness straps hung dangling. The animals tugged at the shafts. The carriage bowled along, swaying as it gathered speed, until the swerve around the carriage ahead was completed, and the horses moved apart, still with their narrow heads inclined toward each other. An elderly gentleman came quickly toward the front entrance, stopped on the dry mosaic paving, turning around, and he then gazed into the rain, which, wedged in by the narrow street, fell confusedly. Rabin put down the suitcase with the black cloth cover, bending his right knee a little in doing so. The rainwater was already running along the edge of the carriageway in streaks that almost extended to the lower-lying gutters. The elderly gentleman stood upright near Rabin, who was supporting himself by leaning slightly against the wooden doorpost. From time to time he glanced toward Rabin, even though to do so he had to twist his neck sharply. Yet he did this only out of a natural desire, not that he happened to be unoccupied, to observe everything exactly, at least in his vicinity. The result of this aimless glancing hither and thither was that there was a great deal he did not notice. So, for instance, it escaped him that Robin's lips were very pale, not much less so than the very faded red of his tie, which had a once striking Moorish pattern. Now, had he noticed this, he would certainly have made a fuss about it, at least inwardly, which again would not have been the right thing, for Robin was always pale, even if it was a fact various things might have been making him especially tired just recently. "What weather!" the gentleman said in a low voice, shaking his head, consciously. It was true, but still in a slightly senile way. "Yes, indeed, and when one's supposed to be starting on a journey, too," Robin said quickly, straightening up. "And it isn't the kind of weather that will improve," the gentleman said, and in order to make sure of it once more, for the last time, bent forward to glance in scrutiny up the street, then down, and then at the sky. "It may last for days, even for weeks. So far as I recall, nothing better is forecast for June, and the beginning of July either. Well, it's no pleasure to anyone. I, for instance, shall have to do without my walks, which are extremely important to my health." Hereupon he yawned, and seemed to become exhausted, since he had now heard Robin's voice, and, occupied with this conversation, no longer took any interest in anything, not even in the conversation. This made quite an impression on Robin, since after all the gentleman had addressed him first, and he therefore tried to show off a little, although it might not even be noticed. "True," he said, "in town one can very easily manage to go without what isn't good for one. If one does not do without it, then one has only oneself to blame for the bad consequences. One will be sorry, and in this way come to see for the first time really clearly how to manage the next time, and even if in matters of detail, footnote, 2 pages missing. Continuing. I don't mean anything by it. I don't mean anything at all," Robin hastened to say, prepared to excuse the gentleman's absent-mindedness in any way possible, since, after all, he wanted to show off a little more. "It's all just out of the book previously mentioned, which I, like other people, happen to have been reading in the evening recently. I have been mostly alone, owing to family circumstances, you see, but apart from anything else, a good book is what I like best after supper. Always has been. Just recently, I read in a prospectus a quotation from some writer to... Just recently, I read in a prospectus a quotation from some writer or other. A good book is the best friend there is. And that's really true. It is so. A good book is the best friend there is." "Yes, when one is young," the gentleman said, meaning nothing in particular by this, merely wanting to indicate how it was raining, that the rain was heavier again, and that now it was not going to stop at all. But to Robin it sounded as though, at 60, the gentleman still thought of himself as young and energetic, and considered Robin's 30 years nothing in comparison, and as though he meant to say, besides, insofar as it was permissible, that at the age of 30 he had, of course, been more sensible than Robin, and that he believed, even if one had nothing else to do, like himself, for instance, an old man, yet it was really wasting one's time to stand about here in this hall looking at the rain. But if one spent the time, besides in chatter, one was wasting it out. But if one spent the time, besides in chatter, one was wasting it doubly. Now Raban had believed for some time that nothing other people said about his capabilities or opinions had been able to affect him. On the contrary, that he had positively abandoned the position where he had listened all submissively to everything that was said, so that people were now simply wasting their breath, whether they happened to be against him or for him. And so he said, "We are talking about different things, since you did not wait to hear what I was going to say." Please go on, the gentleman said. "Well, it isn't so important," Raban said. "I was only going to say books are useful in every sense, and quite especially in respects in which one would not expect it. For when one is about to embark on some enterprise, it is precisely the books whose contents have nothing at all in common with the enterprise that are the most useful. For the reader who does after all intend to embark on that enterprise, that is to say, who has somehow become enthusiastic, and even if, as it were, the effects of the book can penetrate only so far as that enthusiasm, will be stimulated by the book to all kinds of thoughts concerning its enterprise. Now, however, since the contents of the books are precisely something of utter indifference, the reader is not at all impeded in those thoughts, and he passes through the midst of the book with them, as once the Jews passed through the Red Sea. That's how I should like to put it." For Raban, the whole person of the old gentleman now assumed an unpleasant expression. It seemed to him as though he had drawn particularly close to him, and it was merely trifling. Footnote: 2 pages missing. Continuing. "The newspaper too. But I was about to say, I am only going into the country. That's all, only for a fortnight. I am taking a holiday for the first time for quite a long period, and it's necessary for other reasons too. And yet, for instance, a book that I was, as I have mentioned, reading recently taught me more about my little journey than you could imagine." "I'm listening," the gentleman said. Raban was silent, and, standing there so straight, but his hands into his overcoat pockets, which were rather too high. Only after a while did the old gentleman say, "This journey seems to be of some special importance to you." "Well, you see, Raban said, once more supporting himself against the doorpost. Only now did he see how the passage had filled up with people. They were standing even around the foot of the staircase, and an official, who had rented a room in the apartment of the same woman as Raban had, when he came down the stairs, had to ask the people to make way for him. To Raban, who only pointed at the rain, he called out over several heads, which now all turned to Raban, "Have a good journey," and reiterated a promise, obviously given earlier, definitely to visit Raban the next Sunday. Footnote: 2 pages missing. Continuing. "Has a pleasant job, and which he is indeed satisfied, and which has always been kept open for him. He has such powers of endurance, and is inwardly so gay that he does not need anyone to keep him entertained, but everyone needs him. He has always been healthy. Oh, don't try to tell me." "I am not going to argue," the gentleman said. "You won't argue, but you won't admit your mistake either. Why do you stick to it so? And however sharply you may recollect now, you would, I dare wager, forget everything if you were to talk to him. You would reproach me for not having refuted you more effectively now, if he so much as talks about a book. He instantly ecstatic. He's instantly ecstatic about everything beautiful. Translated by Ernst Kaiser and Ethne Wilkins.